pleasure to greet you to 2025 edition of Accelerate. For those of you who don't know me, I've spent a little over 30 years in financial services here around the world, both as a practitioner. I worked in capital markets as an analyst, as a chief operating officer of an insurance company, but also leading technology vendors who are really driving change, enabling change in the market. And for those of you who are T.S. Eliot fans, they say that April is the cruelest month, although with tube strikes and the rest, you might disagree. And being a slightly older dog, I can tell you that, October 1987 wasn't a huge amount of fun either. But, when you're at times of crisis and fear, it's important to think about what some of the ingredients of those are. And this article from the Financial Times, from Pillar to Clark in June, really caught my eye. So I'd invite you to imagine waking up in a world where insurance disappears from entire regions, not because people don't need it, but because they can't get it. The risks have become too severe or too unpredictable to underwrite and price and put in the market. The sort of way that this happens is, potentially, at least according to the article, that as climate shocks intensify, for example, traditional insurance models start breaking down in terms of capacity and coverage. When that coverage retreats, you get mortgage markets seizing up, and indeed, property values collapse as a result. The result is that the scaffolding of finance of entire economies starts to falter. And this isn't distant or limited to housing. This principle can be applied more generally. It's already happening in some familiar places. But the important point here is that insurance doesn't simply manage risk. It allows us to underpin financial services and the entire economy and societies itself. So what you all do, everybody here, is really fundamental. It's really important. And that's why we've chosen this as our landscape to build a business and to spur change. Now, when insurers innovate, they don't just protect their balance sheets. They unlock resilience for all of society. In fact, the World Economic Forum earlier this year identified insurers as resilience builders. They mobilize capital. They enable economies to recover and go from strength to strength despite the inevitable challenges that we face. And this is far from being some back office type of activity. This is something where we hold the ability to actually shape and define the resilience of the economy. So it's, from my point of view, and I hope from yours, it's an exciting time to be in insurance. It's a meaningful time to be here. This opportunity shift from being often perceived as very cautious guardians of risk to actually enablers of innovation, not just in our own industry, but across all of society in a volatile world. And so today, as Kathy mentioned, you're going to hear about some of the levers that let us rise to that challenge and redefine how insurance supports tomorrow's economy, tomorrow's society, and a brighter future. But there are, make no mistake, real barriers that stand in the way. Legacy systems, a good example, but just one. More than 40% of gross written premiums in the P&C market alone still sit on mainframes. And it's less about, technology preferences. It's the fact that those tend to come with costly handoffs, delays, and we see that changes still take too long to go from an idea to in market. In fact, in the recent Earnix Trends report, we saw that 34% of carriers needed 6 months to make relatively simple changes to products, such as rate changes and so on, which, and this really caught my eye, the reason I mention it, this is actually up from 27% in 2022. So something very important is going on there, and I think it can be, largely explained by structural friction and, increasing challenges of maintaining some of those older systems. But more than that, we end up with siloed tooling. When you end up with distribution of products, underwriting of products, pricing of products, all being treated as individualized decisions, then if they don't move together, the risk is you end up with unintended consequences, and you end up with constant churn of rework. But more than that, we've got a secular change going on. For those of us who are a little more silver in the hair, we know that seasoned experts, the people with the 20 years plus experience, and this is particularly the case among underwriters and actuaries, the judgment that they've been able to exercise is leaving the marketplace, and yet the new cohorts expect different kinds of support, different kinds of workflow, at the same time as we're dealing with much more difficult and volatile risk profiles. And so the industry, which still struggles to attract as much talent as it would like, actually, despite the fact that we ourselves have done very well on this front, it is interesting when you look at the surveys, whether you look in the UK, the US, wherever it may be, you find only 4 or 5% of young people view insurance as a place that is really viable for them to make an interesting career. We'll chat over cocktails about the Gen Z stare and all the rest of it, but I think that's just indicative of the fact that productivity has to come from the operating model, not just headcount and so on. In fact, a couple of months back, I was having a conversation with the chief underwriting officer of a major global insurer. Actually, we met here, even though they aren't a brand that you normally associate with being a UK brand. And what he explained was exactly this. They're looking at their organization and really aware of this tsunami of talent that is leaving and thinking very hard about how they support their business and their opportunities on a global basis in the future. Those barriers I talked about, they lead to missed opportunities to actually respond to and profit from changing market dynamics. And there's a proliferation of emerging and changing risks, both changes in existing risks, as I'd laid out at the start, but also entirely new and often stochastic risks like cyber and beyond. And the challenge is that a bunch of those new risks, they lack the traditional infrastructure that we depend on for our modeling and so on. Rich, consistent historical data that you can do regressions on and so on. And so the net effect is that even when they can get to understand the risks, for many insurers, they find the machinery is simply too slow. Which is why the imperative is clear. We must modernize. And yet insurers tell us that they struggle to modernize. It's proving difficult. Every carrier I know has a change management fatigue from drawn-out technology initiatives. Nobody loves those technology programs that look like an SAP project from 2003. And the numbers tell us that this is widely perceived to be an issue. So we really need to focus on a different way of working. And indeed, insurance is at a crossroads with legacy systems, with these difficult projects, as well as a world of rising risks and regulatory constraints and the rest. All of that is colliding with a demand for change from consumers and the reality of what the world needs. Actually, personally, As I mentioned, I've been in this sector at least for a while. We've seen this before in capital markets. In capital markets, we saw digitization, everything becoming real time, straight through processing. These things combined and enabled a very rapid change in the industry that unleashed 2 trillion more in volume. And most importantly for the people in this room, I think, the winners at the end of that period were not the winners at the beginning and weren't necessarily the ones that you would have even picked as the winners. I think that's a very important lesson when we look at our own industry, and one that we can gain some insight from and leverage. But history tells us that modernization, it isn't simply a technology problem. These tend to be matters of, yes, core systems updating is necessary. It's by no means sufficient. True modernization means you've got to rethink your operating model, rethink some of your culture, and particularly to embed the ability to innovate and adapt continuously. So during the course of the next couple of days, you're going to hear from many bold leaders who've moved with urgency, which I think is really key. Urgency and momentum really makes a difference. And part of the reason that's so important is you need to build the muscle memory for change by making small, controlled, incremental, but rapid steps taken repeatedly. AI, to be clear, doesn't replace modernization. It's not a way of outsourcing it. It amplifies it. It allows us to automate where trust is possible. It elevates human judgment rather than replacing it, but it elevates it where it matters most. And it connects decisions, ideally, under a single governance model. And part of the issue is that there's a gap at the moment between ambition and execution. In our surveys, we know that 70% of insurers plan AI implementations in the next 2 years, but only 29% have made any start on it today. But the leaders will be those who can apply the different AI modalities to the different use cases. They need to be able to scale insight and execution across the business and govern AI use in a responsible way that's appropriate for what is, on a global basis, a regulated industry. And the goal really is to cross the chasm from tactical deployments to integrated strategic leverage of AI as an enabler for modernized operations and true innovation. And that's exactly what dynamic AI for insurance is designed to do. Earnix has been at the forefront of dynamic AI for many years. We're fortunate to be one step ahead, always focused on the customer outcomes and the next opportunity. But the goal is very much to build capabilities that help you to anticipate that turbulence that's inevitable and adapt with confidence. What's critical is to apply, as I said, the right AI modality to the right scenarios. So there are 3 modalities, 3 types of AI, and 3 roles. There's predictive AI, which is where we've lived for many years. This gives you the engine for accuracy and scale that powers things like pricing and risk segmentation, optimization, low latency rating, and so on. You use that when decisions must be fast, auditable, repeatable. There's generative AI, the hot new kid on the block, much talked about, often used as a productivity layer. Allows us to summarize documents, draft communications, explain KPI variances, particularly when those KPIs are complicated and you're dealing with a different audience that hasn't actually been involved in putting those together. That allows us to generate speed for people rather than milliseconds for machines. And this I think is a critical, the critical third component, the orchestration layer, agentic AI. That allows us to trigger data pools, run tests, open tickets, prepare filings, and so on. And one of the key things is that it allows us to do that, but with a human-in-the-loop kind of approach, at least at this stage, because we know this is insurance, it's regulated, nobody wants to purely let the car drive itself in this particular case. But success really comes from intelligent decisioning at scale. That's our primary application. And the true value of dynamic AI is uniting those different modalities, doing so with a common governance approach, and making sure that those aren't three tools used in isolation. There are a bunch of really quite interesting overlapping use cases in this particular Venn diagram. And a key element of how Earnix delivers that is really, in terms of driving record speed. Insurance by its nature, like much of life, relies on thousands of decisions, and our platform makes every decision count by putting governed analytics right where the work is happening, so that you know before, but also particularly so that leaders can see the trade-offs and do the what-if analysis before that goes into production. And critically, this is end-to-end by design. So when we talk about putting things in production, we're looking at ingesting data and running models and so on, but we have to be able to make sure that we can deploy changes, but under governance, so that teams can move fast and stay in command of the situation. And indeed, Earnix is moving rapidly. We're taking these capabilities, we're enabling your teams to operationalize. And one of the things you'll hear about from one of my colleagues later, Barry, is AI Studio. I'm not going to step on his punchline, but essentially the layman's explanation, this is purpose-built decisioning support for insurance. And as I say, I'll let him explain how that works and so on, but the key value is that, with these kinds of approach and acceleration, but with safeguards, insurers can actually embed agents into operations with confidence and at scale, because after all, for most of our businesses, if we're not doing this at scale, it might be interesting, it's just not meaningful. Key thing is, this is working. We are seeing remarkable increases in adoption and usage. We're seeing customers move from pilots to production. And the shift is that this is no longer a question of experimentation at the edges. This is the beginning of a majority shift in the marketplace. And it's an operating shift right at the core of our customers' businesses. Now, there are many examples of Earnix-enabled intelligent decisioning in production. You're going to hear a little bit later from Mahmoud. You'll hear from Nicolas Leclerc and Christophe Bourguignon. But the key thing is they've been able to drive much more rapid movement into the marketplace. And the point is that Mahmoud is a great example, but it's just one example. There are many more. This is not a lab demo. It's not a science fair experiment. And the common thread is that this is really about an operating shift. You're going to keep hearing this from customers and some of my colleagues today and tomorrow. But this really builds on a consistent playbook. And the key thing is that, at the start, I asked you to imagine that world where insurance pulls back and the foundations of the economy begin to falter. That picture really demonstrates to us the cost of inaction. In insurance, we don't just think about risk all day. We think about risk our whole careers. And we've become very good at assessing what the risk is of doing things, but actually this is a general human nature. It's not unique to insurance professionals. We tend to be less good at assessing the risk of inaction. I think it's important that we flip that perspective. The real risk is not starting soon enough. Choose your own pace, but start now. Because if you wait too long, the risks that are compounding, the competitors that are gathering, the regulation that encroaches, mean that you will have really missed that opportunity to shape and define your own future. And the good thing is that there's proof it's really happening. You know, companies like Mahmoud are already responding faster in the market. They're taking advantage. And these are not one-off experiments. This is replicable and replicable at scale. So hopefully, giving you a few things to think about, I am really keen that as you listen to some of the sessions, that you consider how it is that you can apply these approaches in your own business. We have an amazing set of speakers, industry luminaries, great customer case studies, brilliant colleagues, and of course the incomparable and endlessly entertaining Tim Harford from the Financial Times. I'm looking forward to hearing from him and to hearing all of you grill him on the many aspects of this. So, wonderful. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to my colleague.